We're going to go ahead and get the ball rolling for our very fascinating, fun lunchtime discussion about Asia's impact on North America's energy equation. And at this time, I will turn the mic over to Mr. Stephen DeBoer.
Well, I was going to say good afternoon, but it's almost afternoon. It's a rather early lunch. Let me introduce myself. I'm Stephen DeBoer, Director General for Trade Controls at Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs Trade and Development. I'm here in my personal capacity of nothing to add with respect to trade controls and either this panel discussion or actually this conference. I am a member of the Canada-US Law Institute Advisory Board and a graduate of Western Law School, and I was an exchange student here at Case Western Reserve University, so I'm a big fan of the law school here, my own law school, Western. And I also grew up on the most beautiful Great Lake, Lake Huron, on the Canadian side. We thought as panelists here today that we would organize ourselves a little bit differently in that because we know that you're all be eating your lunch, we're not going to have PowerPoint presentations. We are actually going to have more of a discussion amongst ourselves and then invite participation from all of you. And I think that that's going to work out very well, particularly given the way the discussion has gone off this morning, and particularly in light of the opening or the keynote address. I should also say that the panel is composed mostly of expertise with respect to China. So the focus, even though we're talking about Asia officially on the conference proceedings, we were going to be talking mostly about China. Let me first, in the North American context, let me first introduce our panel. So, ladies first, Linda Gao is an associate professor of law at Fudan University School of Law in Shanghai and is currently a visiting professor at Case Western Reserve School of Law here. She has her JD from Wilmette University School of Law, an LLM in comparative law from the National University of Singapore, and an LLB in International Economic Law from East China University of Political Sciences and Law, member of the Oregon State Bar and the New York State Bar Associations and the China Law Society. The far end, we're joined by Alan Goldner, who's a partner at Bench Attorneys at Law. He's a co-chair of the firm's China practice, an active member of its corporate and securities practice group, and he has served as the firm's managing partner from 1991 to 1999, and an alum of Ohio University, as is our final panelist, Edward Chow, who's a senior fellow in the Energy and National Security Program at CSIS, and is an international energy expert with more than 30 years of oil industry experience. He spent 20 years, for example, at Chevron Corporation, graduate of Ohio University with a bachelor's degree in economics and a master's degree in international affairs. Just to set this up a little bit, and it's a bit of a repeat, I think, but from this morning's discussion, but as we talked about earlier, and Ambassador Freeman mentioned this as well, there are predictions that by 2020, North America will be a net energy exporter. He also talked a great deal about energy interdependence across the world. We also talked briefly about China being the world's largest energy importer with the requisite need for access to secure supply, and that these two factors have enormous impacts geopolitically, but most importantly, from our perspective, have enormous impacts on North America. So, for example, from a Canadian perspective, this might mean new markets for Canadian energy and a reduction of Canada's dependence on the U.S. Market. And China's increasing dependence on oil imports, the need for Chinese companies to develop technical expertise for their more challenging resources, and attempts to capture value upstream are key factors driving national oil companies to invest in international projects and form strategic international commercial partnerships. And since 2008, it's been noted that Chinese national companies have purchased assets in the Middle East, North America, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And here in North America, again, we talked about this this morning. There's the Nexon Energy deal, Sinopec's joint venture with Chesapeake Energy of Oklahoma City, Sinochem international stake in West Texas Wolfcamp, and concerns both on the U.S. side and on the Canadian side with respect to Chinese enterprises and control of the North American energy sector. And so with that background and recalling everything that we've talked about this morning, I first want to turn the discussion over to Edward and ask him whether we've painted an accurate picture of the energy picture in Asia and in particular in China. What else do we need to know and consider? What is the mid to long-term energy outlook for countries like China, and what will they be looking for in North America?
Thank you very much. Accurate, but probably not in terms of timing. It's actually already here. It's not coming. It's been here for more or less for the last 10, 20 years. If you look at the sweep of global energy demand growth for the past 10, 15 years, for example, China represents something like 40% of all global incremental oil growth in demand. I do international oil and gas. That's my field, and I look at not only China but Asia in general. So one of the things that has happened in the last, I would say 10 years now at least, is that Asia is the incremental demand center for the world. That is not only China, but also India, whose energy demand growth rate is commonly forecasted to exceed China's in the next decade in terms of great growth rate. It's Southeast Asia, where a lot of economic growth is going. Southeast Asia, which has traditionally been an energy exporting region. If you think about particularly Indonesia and Malaysia, is going to be a net oil and gas importer before too long. And also the Middle East. Those are the demand centers for the world. You contrast that with the North American experience, which particularly because of the shale gas and tight oil revolution, for most of the post-War War II period, we in North America have been the incremental demand center of the world. That is no longer the case. That demand has shifted to China, India, and Southeast Asia in particular. It's already happened in oil. In October of last year, China was the largest oil importer in the world. By most conventional estimates, China this year will replace the United States as the largest oil importer on an annual basis. And the next thing that's going to happen is going to be gas, not oil, which clearly has significance for North America in terms of our export picture. Today, natural gas is very underrepresented in the Chinese energy mix. It's about 5% of primary energy. The global average would be about 20. So they're hoping to reach 10% energy mix through gas by 2020. If that were to happen, and if the growth of overall energy demand at the same time, that's going to have a huge impact on the global gas market in a way that Chinese footprint had such a big impact on the oil market for the last 10, 15 years. So the future is going to be on gas in particular. A lot depends on what's going to happen with China on unconventional gas. Here, the definitions are a little different. So when China talks about unconventional gas, it's not just fracking. It's actually very little fracking because that has just started. They're talking about coal bed methane, tight gas, coal gasification. All that is mixed up in unconventional gas in Chinese mines. If you look at Chinese forecasts of what their gas demand is going to come from post-2020, most of that, according to Chinese estimate, would come from unconventional gas. But what if their estimates on unconventional gas production doesn't happen? Then they will continue to have a rather large impact on the global LNG market in particular. Why would China be interested in more gas? Well, if you've visited China recently and tried to breathe the air in China, you will know why they're doing it. It has little to do with climate change, little to do with greenhouse gas emissions. I think we in the West make a big mistake to talk to the Chinese about greenhouse gases. The reason they'll be doing it is to bend the growth in coal demand, because they're concerned about the sort of environmental pollution that we were concerned about in the 60s and 70s, and that is water pollution, it's SOx, NOx, particulates in the air. Those are the reasons why they're concerned about it, and gas has to be a large part of the answer for China. What would the North American exports of gas might mean to the Asian market is a pretty interesting thing to ponder, and I won't spend too much time on it. But in North America, as you know, we have gas-on-gas competition. We are the only part of the world that has gas-on-gas competition, which is why our gas prices are not linked to oil prices. And other globally traded gases are all linked to oil prices, long-term take-or-pay contracts, and so on. So when we start exporting gas from North America, whether it's from BC or the US, we're going to have an impact on the global LNG market in a way that we haven't seen yet, and which is perhaps a larger spot LNG cargo market that's not linked to oil prices, and that'll be interesting to watch. On the point of Chinese investment in the oil and gas sector globally, I really think it's much ado about nothing. If you're looking at it from a Chinese point of view, they're Johnny-come-latelys in the international oil and gas patch. Wherever they go around the world, the Americans, the Brits, the Italians, and the French were already there 50 years ago, right? So what they're doing in terms, if you look at it as a percentage of total global investment in oil and gas, is actually quite tiny. And why shouldn't they be doing it? Why wouldn't we want them to do it? When Chinese don't invest in the world, we tend to call them free riders on the global system. When they do invest, we feel threatened by them. And so that's a tension within our own way of thinking that needs to be resolved somehow. It's really not whether they invest or even the scale of investment, it's whether they're going to change the rules of the game of investment that's important. Because after all, most of the Asian companies are national oil companies, and this go beyond China now, beyond CNPC, Sinopec, CNOOC, Sinochem, and so on. The Indian oil and gas companies are state enterprises. Are they going to change the rules of the game, or will national oil companies from Asia over time convert themselves into international oil companies, just like BP, Total, Eni, and others had in the 60s and 70s. By the way, we complain about the French and the Brits also in the 1960s, about the way they went about doing business. The French seem to have a lock on Francophone Africa. What are the Italians doing with the Libyans all the time? So it's not so different from looking at China and South Sudan. This is not a new phenomenon. It is just coming from a different place, and that's the place where a lot of the action in the international oil and gas is going to be over the next 20 years. With that, I'm going to stop.
Well, thank you very much. It's fascinating thesis, and I think it'll be quite provocative for people here to discuss. And I think that leads very nicely into the expertise that you, Linda, bring to this discussion. And specifically, what is it that we need to know about Chinese state enterprises? What sort of misunderstandings do we have about these investors? What is the relationship between them and the government? And what are some of the misconceptions about this investment in the North American context?
Okay, thank you, Stephen, for your question, for your introduction. Actually, I feel very humbled to attend this conference. When Professor Culkin just invited me to attend it, I just felt, because energy law is not my area, and I'm not familiar with the energy industry. And also this conference is about so this conference is about the U.S. and Canada. I didn't know why China would be an issue in this conference. Then, when I came here today, I just discovered from the opening keynote address, I just found China has been frequently mentioned in almost everybody's speech. At least once. Okay, some people talked about China all the time, and other speakers at least mentioned once. So I think it is very interesting. And regarding the question that Stephen just asked me about the SOEs in the state-owned enterprises in China, I actually also did not think it would be an issue. But now I just know we just lack of the communication and understanding with each other. So different people from different countries have different concerns. Okay, like the state-owned enterprises in China. So actually, before 1978, I would say most of the business enterprises were wholly owned by the state. And at that time, there had no concept like cooperation or cooperation law in China, because those business entities, they were regarded as a department of the government, because the government could appoint and remove the factory leaders or managers of those enterprises. And China adopted a planned economy policy at that time. So everything would be determined by the central government regarding where to purchase the raw materials and what to produce and whom to sell the product to. Everything was set by the government. And that situation had been changed since 1978, when the leader Deng Xiaoping, he proposed for the economic reform. So basically, starting from then, the Chinese policy has been shifted from a planned economy to a market-oriented economy. And the government started to withdraw from the business activities of its enterprises. So starting from then, the state-owned enterprises have been transformed to the corporations. And those corporations, some of them have been privatized, owned by the private individuals or institutions. And still some of them are only partially owned by the state. But there are still around about more than 100 enterprises. They are owned by the central government, by the state. So the Chinese law has been changed in order to deal with the new issues after this transformation. So the Chinese cooperation law has been revised. Actually, it was revised in 2005, which had a separate section regarding the enterprises wholly owned by the state. As a corporation, such state-owned enterprises is just like any other corporations. The only difference is shareholders are different. So for wholly owned enterprises, the shareholder is the state. So basically, the relationship between the state and the SOE is the relationship between a shareholder and a business entity. But of course, in this case, the shareholder is the state, so its management officers, they could still be appointed by the state government. But many of the state-owned enterprises, they have become partially owned by the private investors. Like most of the listed corporations on the Chinese securities markets, they are partially owned by the state and partially owned by the public investors. So the Chinese government is trying very hard to detach or separate the ownership right with the management right. This is not only for state-owned enterprises, but also for all of the other privately owned enterprises. because that is a change of the Chinese law and Chinese policies from back in 1978. And I think after this transformation, the old planned economic policy has been changed. I think this transformation had been completed in around 2005. Of course, there had been some other problems like the equity share problem with those state-owned enterprises which are listed on the Chinese securities market. And Chinese SEC, it's called CSRC, China Securities Regulatory Commission, they have also promoted the transformation of those listed state-owned enterprises to be transformed further. Each of such SOEs, they have made a plan to release those state-owned shares, to allow those shares to be freely traded on the stock exchanges. But of course, each corporation, they have their own schedule or phasing out period for this. So this is the basic situation of the state-owned enterprises. But in China, actually, the Chinese concern, maybe you're not very familiar with, one of the concerns is about the loss of the state-owned assets. Because right after the economic reform, many state-owned enterprises, they have got more flexible, more powers, to flexibly decide their management goals and operation guidelines and stuff. And some people, they have taken their positions to actually cheaply sell the state-owned assets. So that has become an important concern of the Chinese government. Therefore, China has established institution, actually it's a department, is a State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission to especially control this issue, try to make sure that the state-owned assets will not be cheaply sold. So this is the Chinese concern. So I think I have just heard that the government of the United States and Canada may have different concerns. Concern about whether China would like to control in a certain way, like politically or economically, the foreign industry or foreign businesses. And I think that is because of lack of communication and misunderstanding. Because China has its own concerns. Actually, its main concern is internal stability and how to keep its economic development. And the other important issues is environmental protection and also anti-corruption. So preservation of the state-owned assets is also another purpose. So regarding the energy issues, I think China is a huge country. It needs the natural resources, needs the energy, and also it has many. Actually, the first generation of the private entrepreneurs in China, they have accumulated a lot of wealth, and they have a need to make investment. So in the foreign countries. But I think later Alan would introduce more about, actually the Chinese government has imposed a lot of restrictions on the Chinese enterprises to invest in the foreign countries. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. It's a fascinating perspective, and I hope you are all getting your questions ready. I want to now move to Alan. Alan has worked on a great many of. Alan's going to take it right down to the business of being a lawyer, which will be quite fascinating, given that this is the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. You've worked on a great number of Chinese-American deals, and I know that you just recently worked on an energy FDI deal. And I'm wondering, what are the steps that Chinese firms need to go through before venturing into foreign markets? What have you learned in your practice with respect to some of these issues?
Before I take it down to detail, I'd like to indulge for a second and comment on something that both Edward and Linda alluded to, and that is the fact that there are reasons other than a demand for energy that drives China to invest abroad, starting with the fact that in order to maintain the stability that Linda was referring to, they can't get by on 6 or 7 or 8% GDP growth. They need to get closer to the 9, 10, 11% that they have historically been at in order to deal with the ongoing migration from the countryside to the cities in terms of furnishing jobs. And as exports, by reason of lots of factors, become a more difficult source of revenue and economic growth inside of China, they need to find markets outside of China, including in North America. So I'm not poo-pooing the importance of securing energy assets as a reason for China investing in the US. But I also want to underscore that making a buck and getting a return and, among other things, servicing existing US industries, sometimes in fields in which Chinese companies have significant experience in China, is also a driving force. And as Edward said, and that's not a bad thing, because if they're pouring hundreds of millions or billions of dollars into investments here, not insignificant portions of that are going into infrastructure, which Lord knows we need. So now on to some more boring things. Before a Chinese company can cross a North American border, it has to cross the Chinese border. And in order to do that and to make investments here, which is sometimes referred to as going out, there's an approval process. Now, the great news is that this heretofore very complicated approval process, which required multiple Chinese administrative agencies to get involved, depending on the size of the transaction and other factors. As a result of a law that was passed I think in December of 2013, things are supposedly simplified. That's the good news. As is often the case in any country, but particularly in China, when the high-level legislation comes out, adopting a new law with ostensibly all kinds of good things that will come from it, the details are still not out. So the so-called implementing regulations are yet to come out. So in a transaction in which I'm working right now, that's an energy-related transaction, where a Chinese listed company is going to be making a significant investment in the States vis-a-vis a US public company. And by the way, just when we say listed, and I think Linda made this pretty clear, I don't want to confuse listed with state-owned. Listed is a public company, whether it's on the Shenzhen or Shanghai or Hong Kong Stock Exchange or NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. And it has shareholders, and in China, some of those shareholders can be the state. So when we're talking about a listed company, it's what we conventionally know as a listed company. So the Chinese company that's making this investment needs to get approval generally, and under this kind of influx point where they've liberalized and made easier the rules but haven't followed with the details, we're in a very interesting position. I almost wish we were under the old regime because even though it was more cumbersome, we knew which I's needed to be dotted and which T's needed to be crossed. And when I say we, let me give you a typical lawyering staffing arrangement. So this Chinese listed company has a Chinese law firm, a very sophisticated Chinese law firm, with hundreds of lawyers, including some in the States, that are going to be responsible for getting the Chinese company's permissions to get out of China. And in this case, this deal is also going to be subject to financing. There's going to be a significant financing. And that Chinese company is going to have to therefore deal with the CSRC, the China Securities and Exchange Commission. So because it's a Chinese law firm, and even though we have an office in Shanghai and we're listed and we're registered with the Ministry of Justice, we're not Chinese lawyers. So this is a Chinese lawyer exercise, getting them out and getting the legal aspects of their financing done. But the information, including legal conclusions, etc., that the Chinese lawyers are going to need to complete the application, give their own opinions of counsel, make their own due diligence reports, are going to be largely, they won't be largely, they'll be significantly backed up by the work that the stateside firm will be doing in terms of diligence, negotiating documents, preparing documents, and all the other stuff that go in any M&A go on in any M&A transaction. So let me stop it right there in terms of kind of setting the table as to what the lawyers do, and maybe we can get some interaction going.
Sure. So before I open it up to the floor, I wanted to give all of the panelists the right of rebuttal, or sir rebuttal, with respect to what's been said. If there's anything that you wish to add, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion.
Let me just have a two-finger on the question of whether the Chinese oil companies are really publicly traded companies or state enterprises or not. I don't think it's quite as benign as was described earlier. Because these are majority government-owned companies by and large. When the government goes around the world making deals, it then instructs the companies to do them. Xi Jinping's trip to Central Asia in September. Mr. Putin is going to be visiting China next month. They may not do a deal, but you know it's Gazprom doing a deal with CNPC is the way it's going to come out. So it's my question was really whether what are today national oil companies will over time evolve into international oil companies as the way we think about them in Shell or ExxonMobil and so on or not. Today they are not that. Today the CEO is chosen by the personnel department of the Chinese Communist Party. Be truthful about that. There's the biggest scandal going on in China right now is the former securities chief Zhou Rongkong and the corruption scandal around him and his family. And he was the head of the China National Petroleum Corporation before he became got on the standing committee of the Politburo. These companies are instruments of state today. The question is whether they, for China's own sake, whether they should be evolving to something else or not. I go to China not as frequently as other two panelists, I'm sure, but 2-3 times a year, and I tell my Chinese oil industry colleagues that the first thing you all should consider doing is moving your headquarters out of Beijing. Because as long as you're in Beijing and not in Shanghai or some other commercial financial market center, the impression that you project, fairly or not, is that you are government-controlled companies, and you behave like government-controlled companies. Western oil companies don't build football stadiums in Africa. Chinese oil companies do. I mean, there is a distinction between the two. I think there are lots of good reasons for China's own economic efficiency and competitive reasons why these companies should eventually be truly privatized, floating even more shares than they currently do. A set of reform that was actually been stopped the last 10 years. If they had been going the way they were 15, 20 years ago, maybe we'd already be there now. But the previous government, the previous president and prime minister essentially slowed down reform of the state enterprise sector. The third plenum of the Communist Party last fall, one of the big issues was what does reform of the state sector is going to look like. And this is something for Chinese to resolve and for us to observe, but it is not as simple as sometimes could be described.
Well, thank you very much.
I would just
Anything
like
that-
to
Go ahead.
I don't think for a second that the Chinese government doesn't pick winners. Sometimes that's a sin to talk about in the States, but the Chinese government does pick winners, and they do it for reasons of efficiency and other reasons. They're not going to have two state-owned enterprises competing, making a bid on Unical and competing with each other. Having said that, we're involved in transactions where, for example, one of the big four that Edward referred to, 9 years ago, broke off a piece of itself. It's become a listed company, and it is majority, preponderantly, non-government owned. Having said that, I don't think for a second, if the chairman got a directive from the local party head, maybe not the local party head, maybe somebody higher than that, that something was being done that was not in favor, they pay a lot of attention to that. I just wanted to add that there is some movement. There is some movement. For example, breaking off pieces and letting them be more competitive and letting them get closer to their customers or prospective customers across the Chinese border.
Linda, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, actually, I remember this in the morning's discussion. Some speakers talked about the concern of the China as a threat, and also about the interference of the internal affairs of the Western countries. Actually, I try to convince you. Maybe you may not believe me, but I'm trying to do this. That actually it's not true, because China actually has its own problems, has its own concerns. It needs to focus its own development, and also China actually is learning from Western countries. Okay, for example, for the lawyers, maybe Alan is familiar with, before the foreign lawyers went into China, in China, contract is very short. It's just one paragraph or one page. So after the US lawyers went to China, and now the contract has been hundreds of pages.
I don't know if that's improved. I don't know if that's improved.
And also regarding the mergers and acquisition transactions, and I think in the beginning, China actually is unsophisticated. So it's just believe it is an economic transaction, and if there is a buyer, there is a seller, probably they may negotiate. And then China learned that in the United States there is a CFIUS, and also very strict review process. So now what happened is China has also enacted its own law to review all of those M&A transactions. So trying to impose the restrictions, actually to learn from the Western countries to improve our rule of law, and actually it has imposed lots of restrictions, which may or may not be good, I don't know. But I think it is, overall it is a good thing. But I think some Western friends have tried to, maybe they try to politicalize some economic activities. So I don't think Chinese government has any intent to import its political ideology. or the China labeled itself as a socialist country and socialist. So now China is developing the country as a socialism with Chinese characteristics. But actually, some Western writers have written a book named as China as a capitalist country with Chinese characteristics. Okay, because in many ways, the Chinese government has allowed the industries and businesses to develop more in accordance with the free market policy instead of a strict control by the state. So I'm just thinking if I can do anything, try to convince you that to remove this kind of threat theory, so I would be very happy to do so. And regarding the specific transactions between China and the North American countries, as Stephen has just introduced, China has concluded quite a few big deals in the past years, okay, with the energy business groups, the corporations in the North American countries. And I think how to make sure that both countries or all of the countries, all of the parties can make benefits out of it. I think it's very important to have international cooperation. Actually, China and Canada, I think, has just signed BIT as a bilateral investment treaty last year. So I think that is a very great thing. But on the other hand, the negotiation between China and the United States regarding signing such a BIT the renegotiation started in 2008, but still now it has not been closed. So I think it is more important for the government to sign such kind of investment protection treaties so that both parties' rights and interests could be fully protected.
Thank you. Just to make sure that we're all on the same page, BIT is Bilateral Investment Treaty, which we call FIPAs in Canada. We have almost 25 minutes. I have a commitment to the organizers that we will finish promptly at 1. But we have an absolutely stellar panel here with lots and lots of knowledge. And so I open the floor to questions, and I see Larry Herman. Larry.
Thank you. I think the discussion was very interesting. Edward, I think, has given us a very good profile of Chinese state ownership and explained how so many companies in the energy sector are in fact state-owned, whether partially or fully state-owned. And Alan has made a very important point about even in cases where there is a minority of state participation in the equity of a listed company, that company is often, perhaps always, influenced by the state. So we're talking not only about ownership, but influence. And state-influenced companies from China are of equal concern as state-owned, partially or fully. And the reason is that we're not talking about Chinese companies investing in the manufacturing of refrigerators or bicycles. We're talking about investment in strategic assets. And that is the difference. And that is a reflection, or that is the underlying reason for the concern of governments around the world. When it comes to the investment in strategic sovereign assets, there is obviously a higher degree of surveillance required because these companies that do the investment from China, if they're not state-owned fully or partially, they may be influenced by the state. And that is the major difference. In respect of foreign investment protection agreements, there has been some concern in Canada about the foreign investment protection agreement that has been concluded with China. It has not entered into force, and there has been expressions of concern because Chinese investors get certain advantages in the foreign investment protection agreement that local investors do not have. And that is of great concern, and that's the current debate in the United States on the U.S.-China negotiations. I didn't ask a question, it was just a series of comments.
Let me respond a bit to your non-question. I agree that there's a need for paying attention to security. And anytime there's a protective net that's created, one of the great challenges is, will the mesh in that net be so fine that it catches and keeps out things that should get through it, as well as things that shouldn't? And it's a never-ending tension. I'm much more familiar with the U.S. net and know that it's a very broadly cast one. And it's not just about military security, it's cybersecurity, economic security, labor security, food security. You pick a cabinet department and put security after it, and then add a few more, and that's what's involved. And I am not suggesting for a second that in appropriate circumstances, every one of those might not be valid. But we probably could do a better job of sorting things out, including the opacity of the process, where the criteria for whether or not you have to submit yourself to scrutiny, at least in the US, don't exist. There are no criteria. You find out that you should have if after a press release gets issued, the folks involved with CFIUS say, I don't think so. And the only power they have is the power to rescind the transaction, take it apart. So it's a tension. And it's not just in the CFIUS area, it's also in the area of immigration. And we just have to get better at avoiding throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I sure wish I had a solution to it, but it's just an ongoing tension. And the saddest thing that can happen is what has happened in connection with China, where their reaction was to retaliate and create their own CFIUS. And so, kind of gotcha.
It was always there, though. I mean, it's not like they didn't have a process before. They didn't just formalize it.
Right.
So, yeah.
Linda, do you want to comment on the non-question?
Yeah, okay. Regarding the host country imposed certain, not imposed, actually grant certain preferential policies to the foreign investors, I think China has been doing this for 30 years. Starting from 1978, Chinese foreign direct investment law has always in favor of the foreign investors. So they have enjoyed a super national treatment until in the year of 2008, China started to change certain rules. So basically, during these 30 years, many foreign investors, they could get lots of benefits that domestic investors in China, they could never imagine to have. So I guess that depends on the needs of the country. For example, in China at that time, it needed foreign capital, it needed the new thoughts and management and technology and stuff. So Chinese government decided to adopt this policy. And with the development of its own economy and also because the Chinese government made a commitment with the World Trade Organization, so it decided to treat both international investors and the Chinese investors equally. So I don't, actually I'm not quite sure about the Canadian government's policy in this regard, but I would say it happens, because of different countries' needs at different time.
Thank you. Are there, yes?
Yes, I would like to ask on the subject of corruption and the relationship with the state-owned enterprises. Certainly in the Western press, I think the impression is given that since so many of these state-owned enterprises are owned by the People's Liberation Army, and so many of the generals are living a standard of living that they couldn't possibly have achieved on their salary, this is a source of major concern in Western countries that are being asked to accept the investments from such an entity where it is so well known that there is so much corruption. So what is the effect of that, please?
Actually, I don't think that many of those state-owned companies are owned by the military people. But there is a very serious corruption problem in China because many of the children of the leaders, the top leaders of China, they have taken advantage of their fathers, their parents' position to get a chance to control or to either partially or wholly control certain businesses because of their relationship. So that is a big problem, but not only for the military persons. But now the Chinese government has adopted very strict measures trying to combat the corruption. So if you notice the news in the recent year, there had been many big cases discovered and dealt with by the central government. So all Chinese people thought that this would be the very important point for the Chinese government to be successful. If they want to continue to be successful, they must deal with this corruption problem. We had lots of expectations.
I absolutely agree with what Linda just said. I think that the only long-term solution to the corruption problem is really increasing market competition. I mean, wherever you have large companies that control a lot of assets and political decision-making rather than commercially driven drivers cause decisions to make, that's an open invitation for corruption. This is why I said that state enterprise reform is essential for China for its own economic good, not to please foreigners or anything else. The sort of thing that Alan described, where a major Chinese company spun off a subsidiary, is what you need. And let me give you maybe a further example of what I mean. We know that in our country and in Canada, the entire unconventional oil and gas revolution was driven by small to medium-sized firms. It was not driven by the majors. Exxon came in, bought late, paid too much, and is now regretting it, right? And it is also driven by a robust service and equipment supply sector as well that are able to drive costs down if the price of the commodity comes down. Well, that's what China needs, perhaps, as opposed to CNPC doing shale gas. It's a little bit like Gazprom doing shale gas. It may not work because that is not in the nature of large, centralized decision-making processes. So opening up the sector, removing CNPC's control over pipelines, for example, allowing fairer third-party access to pipelines, has to be part of the ingredients of a policy that could successfully take advantage of technology that was perfected in North America and China wished to have transferred to China. I mean, according to geologist studies, China has a larger shale gas potential than the United States. Well, in order to tap into that, perhaps one of the missing ingredients today is breaking up some of these state monopolies into smaller, more efficient, more competitive units in order to take advantage of the geology that's available. I think ultimately that has to be the answer to corruption. because as long as you have large companies whose management is politically appointed and economic decisions are made at least influenced by politics, people in privileged positions are going to get access to action that other people won't.
I just want to, not on the corruption point, but something that Edward just said reminded me of another point that's maybe worth mentioning. Another way that China is going to get better at both exporting turning its domestic companies into international ones is by following a trend that we're seeing, and that is where they're acquiring minority positions in U.S. companies, almost passive in some instances, where one of the primary purposes is to learn, just to learn. I mean, some people want to put a more sinister overlay on it and say they want to steal technology, but the U.S. companies are pretty good at protecting themselves in those kinds of joint venture arrangements. And that is, and so there's multiple things happening when you see these minority investments. One, the Chinese company becomes a potential logical buyer for a larger interest in that entity. Second, they learn a lot, which they can then take back and use on the ground in China, and perhaps form those SMEs that probably are an important going forward piece.
There was a question over here.
Thank you. When we look at China, my understanding is that it generally plans on a 10-year cycle. You know, we have 5-year, and we have President Lee coming in the first years of his mandate. You know, what's the end point for President Lee when you look at the very issues that you've identified in terms of opening up the economy, in terms of competitiveness, the energy sector, state-owned reform? You know, is there an end point that we can potentially see today? Because, you know, these things were sort of imagined, you know, before you know, he took office. So I'm just wondering if you have a sense of where we might see China at the end of his term.
Well, actually, now China is at a 12th five-year plan period. So this period is from 2011 to 2015. Okay, so it's not after Xi Jinping got to his office and made a 5-year plan. Okay, so it's almost the end of the 12th year, the 12th five-year plan. And I think the new government's goal is still to keep make the Chinese economic development to continue on a healthy way, and also I think one of the main concerns is to combat the corruption, okay, and environmental protection, especially from last year. In the most part of China had suffered air pollution very seriously. So the environmental protection has become one important issue for this government.
If you ask some folks who are seeking to emigrate to North America their reasons, a new one has crept up at least, and that is the ability to breathe. It's pure health for themselves and their families. So the environmental piece is very important. The 10 years perhaps you're referring to is the general political cycle of change of senior leadership vis-a-vis the 5-year plans. And I agree with every one of the points that Linda made. I think that's the emphasis. Maintaining social stability by, if not closing the gap between the richest and the poorest, at least not seeing it widen further, is important. And you can see programs aimed at the poorest, but It's kind of an ironic thing. There is so much growth, and that middle class in China is growing and becoming so prosperous that it's hard for that spread not to increase.
Well, Michael, I'm going to give you the last word.
Thank you. And thanks for coming. We're so happy to see DFATE be represented again, and also the State Department represented again in Coosley conferences. It's terrific. We need you all. I'm Michael Robinson from Toronto. I have a little bit of a different hat on, even though I've been coming here for a long time, and that is as a member of the board of Transparency International Canada, which is the Canadian chapter of TI, of which you probably know there are almost 100 chapters now in the world. And I think we're the leading NGO interested in anti-corruption. I have a two-stage question. One is congratulations, and one is to express a concern and ask a question. The congratulations is for what we have observed as terrific, albeit recent efforts in China to try and stamp out and control domestic corruption. However, it appears to us, just looking at the degree of SOE investment around the world with that huge pile of US Treasury bills that you're sitting on, which is a great idea to invest, that there's been a predominant interest in countries ranking very poorly on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. And that includes Africa and the huge investments by China in Africa through SOEs, and other parts of the world such as Bangladesh. I mean, we probably are aware that the World Bank, yes, the World Bank has expressed a real concern there in stopping the Padma Bridge project because of corruption, and the Prime Minister said, get the money elsewhere, and people are guessing where that is. What steps, if any, does the government envision to try and control corruption on the international investment side outside of China?
So the question is about how to how to prevent the corruption in international business investment. I think this is a very difficult question to answer, and firstly it will be based on the domestic law. From the China's side, China needs to strongly or strictly impose the anti-corruption law within its own country. And then regarding the international investment, I think China needs to thank the foreign investors. For example, actually the United States is the biggest investor in China right now. Regarding foreign investment, the United States businesses have become the number one, the biggest one. So I think during this process, China has learned many things, as Alan just mentioned. We have learned many things from the foreign investors regarding how to manage the cooperation, and also regarding how to eliminate the corruption things. Like in the United States, there is an Anti-Corruption Act, is a foreign FCPA, right? Okay. There's a FCPA. So actually the American lawyers, they would advise their client who intends to invest in China to sign a contract, to put a contract term there regarding the compliance of the FCPA. And for that, Chinese party didn't understand, because that was not a Chinese law. Why, did the US lawyers require us to put it in our contract? So they didn't understand. And later, with more and more such transactions going on, and Chinese people had understood it and decided to accept it. So now I think it has become one of the clauses in the joint venture contracts or other business contracts signed by a Chinese party and a foreign party, especially from the United States. So I think that is also a process for China to learn how to avoid and prevent certain corruptions during doing business.
China has some very strict anti-corruption and anti-bribery laws, with penalties going right up to the death penalty. It's all about enforcement, and that's a gradual process that's happening over time. There are some object lessons that get made, but it's still pervasive, and it's not. There's no silver bullet. It's over time. Prospective business partners have to simply decide that a non-corrupt relationship is essential to doing business with the other side. And that, more than anything else, will probably deal with the problem.
All right. Well, we're right up against our 1 o'clock time. I want to thank you all very, very much. It was an incredible panel with an amazing in-depth knowledge of the situation. So thank you all for your participation, and thank you for your questions and attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. We will be back in 15 minutes.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to source from, I mean, there are businesses, as Alan said, who just want to make as much